stone does not burn. This simple fact, understood by anyone who has watched a fire consume wood and straw and flesh while leaving rock untouched, became the foundation of Clara Whitmore's survival, and the survival of everyone who would eventually shelter in what she built. Stone does not burn. Stone does not care about temperature or wind or the fuel that feeds flames. Stone endures when everything else is consumed, and Clara spent 5 winters carving a space into stone because she had learned, in the worst possible way, what fire could take from those who trusted materials that burned. The fire of 1874 had taken her family on an October afternoon that started pleasant and ended in screaming. Thomas Whitmore had been plowing the north field when the fire crowned the ridge, a wall of flame pushed by wind that turned a controlled burn somewhere to the west into a monster that consumed everything in its path. Clara had been at the house with the children, had seen the smoke, had understood too late what was coming. She had tried to reach the creek with the little ones, had carried the baby and dragged the 2 older children through grass that was already catching, had felt the heat on her back as the fire overtook them. She had survived because she had fallen into a buffalo wallow, a depression in the prairie that held enough mud and water to keep her below the flames that roared over her head. The children had not reached the wallow. Thomas had not reached anything. When Clara climbed out of the mud, her dress still smoldering, her hair burned to stubble, her lungs seared by superheated air, she found what remained of her family in the blackened grass and understood that she would never again trust anything that could burn. She found the bluff 3 months later, walking the prairie like a ghost, looking for something she could not name. The sandstone rose from the grassland like a red-gold wall, solid and permanent, a barrier that fire could not cross and could not consume. Clara stood at the base of that bluff and understood what she was going to do. She was going to cut into it. She was going to carve a space where fire could not reach. She was going to build what Thomas had not had time to build, what her children had needed and had not had, what she would give to everyone who might someday need shelter when the flames came again. The cutting began in the winter of 1874 to 75, when the ground was too hard for farming and the grief was too fresh for anything else. Clara used a hammer and chisel she had traded for, working alone at the face of the bluff, striking stone again and again, breaking off pieces no larger than her fist, making progress measured in inches while her neighbors measured progress in acres. She worked through the cold because the cold numbed her hands and her heart, because the rhythm of hammer and chisel gave her something to think about, besides the screaming that echoed in her memory, because cutting stone was the only thing that made sense in a world that had stopped making sense on an October afternoon. People noticed a widow working alone at a sandstone bluff through the winter months, cutting into rock that no sensible person would try to shape, building something that no one could quite understand. They came to watch, sometimes, the way people watch anything unusual on the frontier. They asked what she was doing. She told them, building a shelter that fire cannot touch. They nodded and went away and talked among themselves about the Whitmore widow, who had been broken by grief and was now spending her days on a project that made no practical sense. Mayor Horace Pettigrew was the first to officially object. He rode to the bluff in the spring of 1875, his horse picking through the sandstone chips that Clara's work had scattered, his face wearing the expression of a man about to deliver wisdom to someone too foolish to understand their own foolishness. Mrs. Whitmore, Pettigrew called out. He did not dismount, preferring to deliver his message from the height that horseback provided. This bluff is public land. You cannot simply claim it for your own and spend your days defacing it. There are proper ways to acquire property, proper uses for public resources. This display of grief, while understandable, cannot be permitted to continue. Clara did not stop working. She struck her chisel, broke off a piece of stone, positioned the chisel again. "It is a fire shelter," she said, without looking at him. "When the fire comes again, people will need somewhere to go. Stone does not burn." "There are no fire shelters in Kansas," Pettigrew said. His tone carried the patient condescension of authority, explaining reality to someone who did not understand it. People survive fires by running, by getting to creeks, by plowing fire breaks. They do not survive by hiding in caves carved by widows who should be remarrying and contributing to the community rather than embarrassing it with public displays of madness. Clara stopped working then. She turned to look at the mayor, her dark eyes hollow in her thin face, the chisel still gripped in her scarred hand. "My children could not run fast enough. My husband could not reach the creek. The fire breaks did not hold." She resumed working, her hammer falling with the same steady rhythm. "If stone is madness, then madness will save lives that running could not save." Pettigrew left without achieving his objective. He would return many times over the following years, sometimes with legal arguments, sometimes with threats, sometimes with offers to have Clara committed to an asylum where she could receive proper care for her obvious mental affliction. Clara ignored all of it. She continued cutting day after day, winter after winter, deepening and widening the shelter that would prove her saner than anyone who had called her mad. What Clara built over those 5 winters sheltered 100 people for 5 days. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what happened when the fire came proved that grief can build what reason cannot imagine. The chamber grew slowly through the first winter, then faster as Clara learned the stone and developed techniques that moved more material with less effort. She learned to follow the natural fractures in the sandstone, to use the weaknesses in the rock rather than fighting against its strengths. She learned to carve a ceiling high enough that smoke would rise and collect rather than suffocating anyone below. She carved ventilation shafts that would draw air from outside while the stone filtered the worst of the smoke. She designed the space not just for shelter, but for survival, thinking through every detail because thinking was all she had left, and she was determined to think her way to something that fire could not destroy. In the second winter, she discovered water. Her chisel broke through into a seam that wept moisture, and she followed it deeper until she found a spring feeding from somewhere beneath the bluff, clean water that flowed regardless of season. She carved a basin to collect it, a channel to drain overflow, a system that would provide water to anyone sheltering inside, without requiring them to venture out into whatever had driven them to seek shelter. The water changed everything. The shelter was no longer just protection from fire, but self-sufficient refuge, a place where people could wait out whatever was burning outside for as long as the burning lasted. The third winter brought help. Samuel Crowfeather appeared at the bluff one December morning, a Pawnee man who had lost everything to a different kind of fire, the fire of cavalry carbines that had taken his family during a raid that the government would later call a mistake. He did not explain why he had come. He did not ask permission to help. He simply picked up a hammer that Clara had set aside and began working at a section of wall that she had not yet reached. They worked in silence for 3 days before either spoke. When Samuel finally broke the silence, it was not to introduce himself or explain his presence. He simply said, "The stone remembers what we carve into it. Long after we are gone, the stone will remember." Clara nodded and continued working, and from that day forward they carved together, two people who had lost everything finding purpose in building something that could not be lost to flame. The shelter was complete by the end of the 5th winter, a cavern large enough to hold 100 people, with room for supplies and water and air, that the stone would keep cool even when the surface baked. Clara had carved benches into the walls, platforms where children could sleep, a hearth where small fires could be built for light and cooking without filling the space with smoke. She had stockpiled preserved food and blankets and lanterns and everything else that people might need if they had to shelter for days rather than hours. She had built not just a refuge, but a fortress against fire, and she had done it with grief and determination, and 5 winters of labor that no one had believed would amount to anything. The fire came in September of 1879. It started somewhere to the southwest, in territory that had not seen rain in 2 months, where the grass was dry as paper and the conditions were perfect for conflagration. A lightning strike, perhaps, or a campfire left unattended, or one of a dozen other ignition sources that turned drought-stressed prairie into inferno. The origin did not matter. What mattered was the wind, blowing steady from the southwest at 30 miles per hour, pushing the fire toward settlements that had never seen anything like what was coming. The warning spread faster than the fire, but not by much. Riders galloped from farm to farm shouting that fire was coming, that it was big, that people should run for the rivers or the creeks or anywhere that water might stop the flames. The nearest river was 8 miles away. The fire was moving at the speed of a galloping horse, and many families did not have horses that could gallop that far, did not have time to hitch wagons, did not have options that would get everyone to safety before the fire arrived. Clara saw the smoke from the bluff and understood immediately what was happening. She had spent 5 years preparing for this moment, 5 winters carving the shelter that would prove whether her grief had built something real or something as useless as Pettigrew had always insisted. She climbed down from the bluff and began walking toward the town, toward the people who had called her mad, toward the families who had never believed that fire could come again the way it had come in 1874. "The fire shelter is open," she announced to the first people she encountered. "Bring everyone who cannot reach the river. Bring food and water and blankets. The shelter will hold. Stone does not burn." The word spread with the desperate speed of survival. People who had planned to run for the river realized they could not make it, turned instead toward the bluff that everyone knew about, but no one had taken seriously. Families loaded what they could onto wagons, abandoned what they could not carry, drove or walked or ran toward the red-gold stone that rose from the prairie like a promise that fire could not burn. 103 people reached the shelter before the fire arrived. 103 people crowded into the space that Clara had carved over 5 winters. Families pressed together, children crying, animals left outside because there was no room for animals, only for people who needed to survive. Clara stood at the entrance as the last families arrived, counting heads, directing people deeper into the chamber, making sure that everyone who had come would fit into the space she had built. Mayor Pettigrew was among the last to arrive. His fine clothes were dirty and torn from the desperate ride to the bluff, his horse lathered and exhausted, his face showing the terror of a man who had run out of options and was now dependent on the madwoman he had tried to have committed. He dismounted at the entrance and looked at Clara with eyes that held no trace of the condescension they had carried in all their previous encounters. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. His voice was hoarse from smoke and fear. "I do not know if there is room. I do not know if you will let me in, but I am asking, please." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The man who had called her Project Madness, the man who had tried to stop her work, to have her declared insane, to tear down what she had built because it embarrassed his sense of how things should be done. The man who now stood before her with hat in hand, asking for the shelter he had said was useless. "There is room," Clara said. "Come in. The stone does not care who you are or what you said about it. The stone will shelter you because that is what the stone is for." Pettigrew stumbled into the shelter and Clara followed, pulling the heavy wooden door closed behind her, a door she had built from green wood and covered with mud and hide to prevent it from burning. The last thing she saw before the door sealed was the wall of fire cresting the ridge to the west, a wave of flame 50 feet high, moving toward the bluff with the roar of a living thing hungry for fuel. The fire reached the bluff within minutes. The sound of it was overwhelming, a continuous roar punctuated by explosions as trees and fences and buildings ignited and were consumed. The temperature inside the shelter climbed, but did not become unbearable. The stone absorbing heat slowly, the ventilation system drawing cooler air from fissures that connected to the surface upwind from the flames. The smoke that filtered in was unpleasant, but not deadly, the worst of it rising to the ceiling, where the ventilation shafts carried it away. The fire burned for 5 days. It burned because the drought had left fuel everywhere, because the wind did not die, because conditions that came once in a generation had aligned to create a conflagration that consumed hundreds of thousands of acres before it finally exhausted itself against a river too wide to jump. For 5 days, the people in Clara's shelter waited, rationing food and water, sleeping in shifts on the benches she had carved, listening to the roar outside diminish and then return as new fuel ignited and burned. 103 people had entered the shelter. 100 people emerged. 3 had died, 2 elderly who were already sick when they arrived, and 1 child who had breathed too much smoke during the journey to the bluff. Their bodies were wrapped and stored in the coolest part of the shelter, a sad but small toll for a fire that killed over 40 people outside, people who had tried to reach the river and failed, people who had sheltered in cellars that filled with smoke, people who had trusted that they could outrun what could not be outrun. The landscape that emerged from the shelter was unrecognizable. The prairie that had been green and gold was now black and gray, every blade of grass consumed, every tree reduced to charred trunk, every building within 20 miles destroyed. The town that Clara had walked to on the day the fire started no longer existed. The farms that had surrounded it were gone. Everything that had been built from wood or grown from earth had been returned to ash by a fire that cared nothing for effort or hope or the years of labor that the burned structures represented. The bluff still stood. The shelter still held. The stone that did not burn had proven itself against the worst fire in Kansas history, and the people who had dismissed Clara as mad now understood that her madness had been the only sanity that mattered. The reckoning came a week later, when the survivors had recovered enough to gather and count their losses and their blessings. They met at the bluff because there was nowhere else to meet, the only structure still standing in a territory of ash. They stood before the entrance to Clara's shelter, the place that had saved them, and tried to find words for what they had experienced. Horace Pettigrew spoke first. He had not recovered his confidence, had not rebuilt the armor of authority that had characterized him before the fire. He stood before the group as simply a man who had survived, who owed his life to someone he had wronged. "I called this shelter madness," Pettigrew said. "I called Mrs. Whitmore a disgrace to the community. I tried to have her stopped, to have her committed, to have her removed from the bluff where she worked." His voice cracked. "I was wrong. I was wrong about all of it. She built what we needed, and we are alive because she did not listen to me." Others spoke. Others agreed. Others acknowledged that the widow who had been dismissed and mocked and pitied had been the only one who understood what fire could do and what it would take to survive it. They offered Clara land, money, positions of authority in whatever community would rise from the ashes. They offered everything they could think of to make amends for how they had treated her. Clara listened without expression. When the offers were finished, when the gratitude had been expressed, when the weight of acknowledgement hung in the air waiting for her response, she finally spoke. "I did not build this for your gratitude. I did not cut stone for 5 winters so that you would thank me. I built it because my children burned and I could not save them. I built it so that other children would not burn the way mine burned. Your thanks are unnecessary. What is necessary is that you remember. Build with stone. Build where fire cannot reach. Build so that when the fire comes again, and it will come again, your children will have somewhere to go that does not burn." The settlement rebuilt around Clara's principle. Stone foundations, stone walls where possible, fire breaks and shelters, and the understanding that prairie fire was not a possibility, but an inevitability. The shelter in the bluff became a community resource, maintained and expanded by people who understood what it meant. Other settlements built their own shelters, carved into hillsides or constructed from stone, the practice spreading across the territory as survivors of the Great Fire taught others what they had learned. Clara Whitmore lived for another 28 years, passing in the winter of 1907 at the age of 73. She never remarried, never left the bluff she had carved, never stopped working on the shelter that had become her life's purpose. She expanded it, improved it, added chambers and storage and everything else that future generations might need when fire came again. She became known throughout Kansas as the Stone Woman, the widow who had cut into rock for 5 winters and had saved 100 lives when the fire came to prove her right. The shelter still exists. The sandstone bluff still rises from the Kansas prairie, and the entrance that Clara carved is still visible, now protected as a historical site. Visitors can walk into the chamber she created and see the marks of her chisel on the walls, the benches she carved, the basin where the spring still flows. They can stand in the space that one grieving woman built over 5 winters of labor, and they can understand what grief can create when it refuses to accept that nothing can be done. There is a small plaque at the entrance now, installed by the Kansas Historical Society in 1952. It reads simply, "Whitmore Shelter, carved 1874 to 1879 by Clara Whitmore. Sheltered 100 people for 5 days during the Great Fire of 1879. The stone does not burn. The settlers who had called her mad, who had tried to stop her work, who had survived because she had not stopped, they understood what those words meant. The stone does not burn. And because one widow had spent 5 winters carving into rock that did not burn, 100 people had lived who would have died. If this story taught you something about building shelter that fire cannot touch, subscribe to Wild West Retribution. We have more forgotten knowledge that saved lives when nothing else could. And tell me in the comments, what would you carve into stone if you had 5 winters to work? 5 winters of cutting, 5 days of shelter, 100 lives. That is the arithmetic of grief when grief decides to build instead of break.